Search the scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospels.
Welcome, dear brothers and sisters, to Search the Scriptures Live, where we interpret the Bible according to the mind and the writings of the early church. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantino, and today's date is Monday, June 30th. Almost said July. Almost July, but it's still June 30th. And this is lesson 121 on the Gospel of Matthew. Normally, I would give you a phone number to call in, or you could write in with your questions, but actually this lesson is pre-recorded. So we're not going live tonight, but you can, of course, make your comments or call in perhaps next week if you have anything to say about tonight's lesson. We are continuing to refute the most common arguments that are raised against the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But before we get to that, let's have our prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. So we're still talking about the resurrection, and I hope you don't mind. You shouldn't mind. This is the single most important doctrine of the Christian faith. Without it, we have no faith. We have no church. We have no reason to belong to the church without belief in the resurrection. But I think it's important to go through all of these arguments that are made, because actually it's helpful to me, or it was helpful to me before in the past when I was thinking about these things. I'm very inquisitive by nature. I want to understand things. And I'm also very skeptical by nature. You might be surprised to hear that, but I like proof. I'm an attorney. I want to hear the arguments for or against something. Most of the time, when we get an argument about something, we're only getting one side. We're getting the side of the people who are for it or against it. But I'm trying to give you the arguments that people make against the resurrection and how we can respond to those things. Because, yes, at a certain point, there's no doubt, the resurrection is a matter of faith, especially for us today, because we don't experience Jesus in the flesh the way the apostles did. So yes, the resurrection has to be accepted on the basis of faith, but it helps if we're nudged in a certain direction. It helps if we can respond to things that people say that people never really have the ability to respond to because they don't know better. And the arguments that are made against the resurrection seem very logical. They seem very plausible. So we're going to show how they're not logical, they're not plausible, and they're actually not very credible. So last week, we talked about the various factors that historians use to evaluate the credibility of an ancient document. And the Bible is an ancient document. Actually, it's a library, a collection of many ancient documents. And here we're talking about the Gospels, and we can include, maybe next week we'll talk about 1 Corinthians, where St. Paul talks about the resurrection also. But, it is on the basis of an objective evaluation of the Gospels that historians consider those writings to be historically credible. I'm not talking about religious claims. I'm talking about historical details in the Gospels. Now, what's very, very sad is that many so-called theologians or so-called Bible scholars are less likely to believe the historical truths in the Bible than actual historians of antiquity, because a lot of theologians and Bible scholars want to show how independent-minded they are, how sophisticated they are, how they're unbiased, how they're unfettered by these kind of backwards religious beliefs. And in fact, historians of antiquity are more likely to consider the Bible a credible source of historical information than a lot of Bible scholars. I'm not talking about all the Bible scholars. Obviously, most of us love the Bible and believe in it, but there are plenty, especially in academia, and some of the most famous Bible scholars don't believe in Jesus Christ. And you ask yourself, how can you be a Bible scholar? How can you teach something you don't even really believe in? But that, in fact, is the case. And this kind of thinking has its roots in this Western mentality. I don't mean to slam other Christians or anything like that. I'm just trying to say that the root, at the basis of this skepticism about the Bible are all of these developments that took place in Western Europe and in the developed world, the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. These periods of history led to people thinking that the human mind and human reasoning was the highest arbiter of truth, and that faith really didn't matter, because unless you could explain something rationally, it couldn't possibly be true. And of course, here we're talking about God. When we're talking about the Bible and something like the resurrection, even the person of Jesus Christ and his life and his miracles, we're talking about God. God doesn't conform to our human reasoning. He's not limited by our human reasoning. But of course, there was this elevation of the human person. Now, in Orthodoxy, we're very strong. We have a very, very strong, what we call anthropology, Christian anthropology. That is, how does that particular church or religious tradition view the human being? We, the Orthodox, have the highest regard for the human person. We really do. We're not going to be able to get into that. We call that Christian anthropology. But we still do not consider the human mind or the human reason as the highest arbiter of truth, as the most important way that we come to know God or even come to know truth. As great as the human mind is, it has its limitations, especially when we're talking about God. But so many of the scholars in our world today have been indoctrinated into this idea that if something cannot be explained according to human reasoning or according to human knowledge or science, it's not true. It couldn't have happened. Well, the Bible has a lot of miracles, including the resurrection, and they cannot be explained by science. That's the nature of a miracle to begin with. That's something that contradicts what our rational mind thinks is possible. Now, because people have this idea that if it isn't rational or it can't be explained in a rational manner, it didn't happen. What they started is this movement that was called demythologizing the Bible. And they were saying that the miraculous stories in the Bible were like ancient myths, like the Greek myths. And our job as Bible scholars, this is what these people were saying, this became very popular in the late 1800s and in the 20th century, very, very popular, to demythologize the Bible. And so they said, what we want to do is take out all these fantastic elements, miraculous elements. And this also coincided with a movement called the Quest for the Historical Jesus. This was a very, very famous movement in the 20th century, the quest for the historical Jesus. And the idea was, if we could just look behind or beyond these miraculous stories, we could find out who Jesus really was. The real Jesus, the man Jesus. Notice, not the God Jesus, the man Jesus, the historical Jesus. And unfortunately, he's kind of hard to figure out. He's hard to find because the church wrote the Gospels and they added all these layers of theology on top of it. And we just have to dig through that till we get to the real truth about who Jesus is. They want to separate, and but believe me, I heard this for decades as a student and with listening to colleagues or other people at conferences. They separated what they called the historical Jesus from the Christ of faith. What are you talking about? They said, and people said this to me. Are you talking about the historical Jesus or the Christ of faith? In other words, there was this guy, the historical Jesus, and then later the church made him into somebody else, the Christ of faith, the cosmic Christ. This is what they used to say. And I used to say, we don't separate Jesus from Christ. That's heresy. Okay, but that is rampant. It's still, there are vestiges in it still in the theological world, But this idea that somehow the Gospels don't present a real historical Jesus because there are miracles like the resurrection is very, very common. So people decided, especially in the 20th century, that they had to find the real Jesus. They had to demythologize the Bible, and that meant you set aside any claims of divinity. And of course, this goes hand in hand with the idea that some of the things in the Bible Jesus really said, but other things he never would have said, and all this other nonsense, okay? So, we believers are criticized for believing the truth of the Bible. And they were very often dismissed, and especially, I hate to say it's true, Orthodox Bible scholars do not get much respect in the world, okay? Because there are certain conclusions we absolutely refuse to draw. Any real Orthodox person, any real Orthodox theologian will never say things because it makes sense to them and contradicts what's in the Bible, okay? But that's the truth, and I can't remember if I think I might have talked about this story in my book Thinking Orthodox, but I was at a conference once where a Bishop Demetrios Trakatellis gave a talk about the New Testament and Bible scholarship. He later became the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Church in America, but at that time it was Bishop Demetrios. I had never heard an Orthodox Bible scholar before, and I was so excited. He gave a phenomenal talk. And afterwards, I asked him, why aren't there famous Greek Orthodox or Orthodox Christian Bible scholars in the world? I know the famous Protestant Bible scholars. I know the famous Catholic Bible scholars. Who are the Orthodox? Not that the Orthodox are not capable of doing scholarship or being known and recognized on that level as kind of world celebrities in our little field. I asked him why we don't have anybody like that in the Orthodox world, who's recognized and respected and famous in other churches. This is what I'm asking. And he said, because they don't respect us. And you know what? That was true. We are not respected because we are unwilling to accept these ridiculous arguments that are made because these other scholars who think that they're so intelligent, we're just going to say what we think is the historical truth, and really they believe that the church added things to the Gospels that never happened. We will never say that. God forbid an Orthodox Bible scholar ever comes to the point where they say that. It's probably maybe happening already because they want to be accepted by everybody else out there in the world. They want to be praised. They want funding. They want these things. So that might already be starting. I think it might be starting in Orthodoxy. But for the most part, we don't do that. And so we are not respected in the academic world, in biblical studies. They're okay with us in church history and patristics. We're great. But in the academic world, it's very difficult to be respected as a Bible scholar if you're an Orthodox Christian, because they think you're just narrow-minded and you're just going to parrot whatever the fathers say and you don't have a brain of your own and the rest, okay? So I just want you to understand this is what is behind the criticisms of the resurrection. And I think I may have shared stories with you before, but I'll give you another example. I was a young college student in a Catholic university, and my professor was a Catholic Christian, and we were studying the Gospel of Mark, and Jesus comes to be baptized, right? And what does it say in the Gospel of Mark? That people came to John, the forerunner, to be baptized, confessing their sins, and they came to be baptized. And Jesus comes to be baptized. And in Mark's gospel, it doesn't explain why he came to be baptized. So my professor actually said, Jesus came to be baptized. That means he had sins. I just about fell off my chair. I was 19 years old. I knew better than that. She had a PhD from another Catholic university. Now, I'm not suggesting that all Catholic Bible scholars are heretics or anything like this, but you can't imagine what goes on in the world of biblical studies. It's very, very sad because they really believe, and this is why I'm trying to tell you, that historians take the Bible much more seriously as a source of historical information because they don't have the bias that Bible scholars do. Because the Bible scholars are very anxious to prove how independent they are, how reasonable they are, how rational they are, how they can dissect the Bible and come up with all kinds of things and explanations that really aren't there. Okay, but that's what we're dealing with here. So when we talk about objections to the resurrection, many of these things are raised by even very famous Bible scholars. I won't even bother to give you their names, okay, because they're not worth mentioning. They're not worth my breath. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. We have many excellent and credible Bible scholars, but that's why sometimes people say to me, do you have any commentaries on the Bible you'd like to recommend? It's very difficult because there are a lot of good commentaries in English written by Catholic and Protestant scholars, but a lot of them have nonsense in them too. And I don't want to recommend that to people. You have to have the maturity and the understanding to know what to ignore. It's okay. I read those commentaries sometimes. You can read commentaries and get good information from them, but you have to know what to ignore from what they say. And this is very similar to the situation we had in the era of the early church, because the fathers of the church were educated by pagans. So they used the pagan learning, that which was not in conflict with the Christian faith, and they ignored everything else. So we have to be wise like that. We have to use whatever is useful to us, but know what we should be ignoring. I'm sorry I had that very long rant, a little bit of a digression here. Well, my point is this. Many people treat the miracles of the Bible, including people who should know better, but they treat it as myths. And they just basically pity us as ignorant, uneducated, narrow-minded simpletons. And they believe that they are the intelligent ones, they're the enlightened ones, but they cannot see their own limitations. They cannot see beyond their own pride and their own narrow-mindedness. So, are there myths in the Bible? Is Jesus, the stories of Jesus, the same as ancient stories about Zeus or Apollo or Mithras or Osiris or any of these other gods? Are the stories of the resurrection different from those mythologies? And I think that that's important to discuss, just as we discussed it way in the beginning when we were talking about the Gospel of Matthew and the virgin birth. Because how often do we hear people say, oh, the story of the virgin birth of Jesus is just like those ancient mythologies? And I explained to you how different it is and why it's so different. We're going to do the same thing here with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is a huge difference between the ancient mythologies that talked about possible, resurrections of gods living again or something like this, or any of the miracles of Christ. It's huge differences. Okay, the big difference, the most important difference, and the one that changes everything is that Jesus Christ was a real historical person. None of those other gods ever existed. Zeus, Apollo, Osiris, Mithras, Poseidon, none of those gods ever existed. Okay? There are no eyewitnesses to the miracles of Asclepius. He was a famous god considered to be a healer in the ancient world. There's no eyewitnesses to that. Okay? Even back then. On the other hand, there were thousands of eyewitnesses of the miracles of Jesus Christ, even his bodily resurrection. The Gospels were written down at a time when there were people alive who knew Jesus Christ, who had met it, who had been healed by him. So, no one writes a book full of stories that are untrue. And while there are people alive who can refute all of those. And that's what we have in the Gospels. The Gospels were written even though they were written decades, possibly 20, 30, 40 years after the time of Christ, there were still many, many people who were alive. People didn't just drop dead when they were 30 or 40 because that was the life expectancy. People lived to old age then too. And there were many people who were eyewitnesses to Jesus Christ, and the gospel writers would not have filled their books with falsities, with falsehoods, if there were so many people around who could refute them and say, this is not true, this never happened. So There were, why do I know that? Why am I so confident that? I'm setting aside the fact that the evangelists were saints and holy men and they wouldn't lie, just setting that aside. Because remember that in the decades following the beginning of the church had many enemies, especially the Jews. The Jewish leaders first got rid of Jesus, and then they tried to stop the movement that he started. They tried to stop the evangelists who were saying that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus did all these miracles. The easiest thing for them to do would be to refute that by saying Jesus never did any miracles, right? I mean, when the Holy Spirit came on the day of Pentecost, it was 50 days after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Do you think there were still people in Jerusalem who had interacted with Jesus, who heard him preach, who had witnessed these miracles? Of course. I mean, the resurrection didn't take place months or years after the crucifixion of Christ. There were still plenty of eyewitnesses around when the church began. And so no one in antiquity ever refuted what Christ did. So this is a very, very strong argument for the truth of what the Gospels say. The Jewish leaders were trying to destroy the early church. Not the Romans at first. They came along later. Don't believe what you see in something like The Chosen. The Romans had no interest in stopping the early church. It made no difference to them. And why is that? Because it was not a separate religion. We're going to talk about that. It was not a separate religion. This was a Jewish group. The followers of Jesus were a Jewish group. The Romans weren't trying to put down Judaism, so they certainly weren't going after the followers of Jesus. It was the Jewish leaders who were trying to stop the church. So many Jews were hostile against the followers of Jesus. They didn't even have the name Christian back then. They called their movement, the apostles called their movement the Way. They didn't even know the word Christian. They never heard it before. So the Jewish leaders tried to stop the followers of the Way. And the easiest way that they could have done that is to say that Jesus never did the things that they claimed. You see what I'm trying to say? And for decades after that, we have no Jewish writers who ever say in the early era of the early church that Jesus never did any miracles. Nobody says that. If Jesus could raise other people from the dead, why couldn't he raise himself from the dead? Do you see what I'm trying to say? And he actually said that. He said, I have the power to lay my life down, and I have the power to take it up again. But none of the people who were living in antiquity, including the Jews, who really reviled the Christians, who hated them, who after they were not able to stop the church, they were cooperating with the Romans to have Christians put to death. We know this from historical records. And I'm not saying this to encourage violence or anti-Semitism. I don't believe in that at all. I'm just trying to lay out for you the historical fact that if Jesus never did any of these things, then that would have been said in the ancient Jewish writings at the time, but we don't see that. For hundreds and hundreds of years, no Jew ever refutes that Jesus did miracles. Instead, they actually affirm it by saying, well, he did those things, but he got his powers from the devil. So they are indirectly affirming the fact that Christ was a miracle worker. They don't agree about where he got his powers from, but they don't deny that he did miracles, you see? So even his enemies admit that Christ had these extraordinary powers, and he explained why they did not come from the devil, right? When he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. In other words, Jesus was exorcising demons out of people. He was healing people. He was removing demons from people. The devil would not have given somebody power to work against himself, against the devil. Why would the devil give somebody power? The devil gives people power to put them under the devil's control, not to get rid of demons. The devil gives people power to harm people, not to help people. So that doesn't make sense. This is what Jesus said. It is absolutely ridiculous to suggest that his power came from the devil. But this is what the Jews said and actually still say, because they think he was a sorcerer. Okay, so if the power didn't come from the devil, then the only place the power could come from is God. All right. So the miracles of Christ are not myths. Okay, that argument kind of makes sense to people who don't know it better. It sounds plausible. It sounds like, well, there were these other myths about gods dying, rising from the dead, and perhaps the most famous was the Greek god Adonis. Okay, and every spring, women who were the main devotees of Adonis, women would celebrate the resurrection of Adonis. So people said, well, he was the lover of Aphrodite. Again, Adonis never existed. It was not a historical person, just like Aphrodite was not a historical person. These were mythological gods. But this story was very popular. So people say, well, Jesus' death and resurrection is inspired by that. It's just another myth. And it's easy to make that claim if you don't really think any further past the surface of that claim. But can you find for me one reference in any ancient document that suggests that Adonis was a historical person? Okay, is there any reference that suggests that anybody saw Adonis alive again? No, because he never existed to begin with. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ is completely different from these ancient mythologies because he was a real historical person. And everything he said and did was witnessed by many people, including the resurrection. So rather than being logical and reasonable to say that Christ's resurrection is just another ancient myth, in fact, to believe that is actually very highly illogical and it's extremely unreasonable. So the Gospels are credible sources of historical information because they describe Jesus Christ and his activities on earth as a historical person within the lifetimes of tens of thousands of people who experienced him. And if you want to know more about why the Gospels are historical, credibly historical, we talked about that in the last podcast, so I don't want to go over that again. But the Gospels have a lot of historical credibility. And so we're going to move on now. Last week, after I explained why and the factors that historians use to evaluate, in other words, historians don't just take an ancient document and say, I'm going to believe everything it says. They are very analytical and they look at certain factors to decide whether or not an ancient document is credible, it's believable, it's a good source of historical information, because they have to draw their own conclusions about history based on what's in the document. So they don't just willy-nilly accept any ancient writing as true. They don't. They have these factors, and I discussed them last week. And last week also, we refuted 4 common claims that are made to dismiss the resurrection. I'm going to list them for you, and then we're going to move on. So last week we talked about the following claims: that Jesus never died. This took 2 forms. He was never crucified. This is one of the things that Muslims say, which of course we know is historically not true. Even Romans talk about how Jesus was crucified, even Roman documents. Or that he never died because he was sort of became unconscious on the cross or fell into a coma and he was buried alive. Of course, that makes no sense because there's no way he could exit from the tomb, because he could never have moved. First of all, he would be surrounded and tied up, not only by all of these strips of cloth that had hardened around the body because they were resin that grew hard, but he was in a larger cloth and then tied at the ankles and the knees and the waist with strips of cloth. He couldn't have extricated himself from it, but even if he could never get out of the tomb because he would not have been strong enough to move the stone. Even if he had never been crucified, he wouldn't have been strong enough to move the stone. Not to mention the fact that outside the tomb, there were Roman soldiers guarding it. So this idea that he got out of the tomb because he never died is ridiculous. The second claim that is made is that Jesus died, but he was never buried, that he was left to rot on the cross, because this is something that the Romans did in other parts of the Roman Empire, especially criminals who were accused of treason. But of course, I explained how this is not true historically. The Jews had a very strong law that anybody who was executed, who died by being hung, had to be buried crucifixion was considered a form of hanging, had to be buried before sunset. Okay, so we know that's not true. The third claim was that Jesus was buried, but he was buried in a common grave for criminals. He was not buried honorably. This is, again, I'm telling you, it's so ridiculous, the things that I read. I've read so many commentaries, and they say, oh, Jesus would not have been buried with honors. This was invented by the church to kind of give him some dignity and respect. Again, the evangelists are writing at a time when there are people who are alive who knew what happened. Okay, and I'm not talking about the year. They didn't write the Gospels in the year 33 or 43 or 53, maybe more like 63 or 73. There were still people alive. Would they say that Joseph of Arimathea came and Nicodemus came and they brought all these spices and they washed him and anointed him and put the spices on him and put him in a brand new tomb? Would they have invented that? There would have been so many people who said that never happened. The gospel writers would have lost all credibility. But I'm telling you, I'm reading these commentaries and they're saying, oh, this is not true. Jesus actually died shamefully and he was buried in a common grave for criminals. Where is your evidence for that? I have some evidence. I have the Gospels as historical records. Where is your evidence for your ideas? It just comes out of your mind, okay? It just comes from thin air. It's based on nothing. Do you see my point? So, but this is what we see again and again and again, unfortunately. So, no, Jesus was not buried in a common grave for criminals. The two thieves may have been, but they were not. Somebody who had a following of thousands of people who believed him to be the Messiah, who saw all of his good deeds, who experienced his goodness, his grace, his love. Jesus was buried honorably, okay? That's what the historical record is in the Gospels, and that actually makes more sense than people just disposing of his body in a common grave along with the two thieves. Do you see my point? So, the last claim that is made by people to dismiss the resurrection is that Jesus was buried, but in a different tomb. So the tomb was found empty on Sunday morning because the mirror bearers went to the wrong tomb. Well, that would have meant that Peter and John, who also ran to the tomb to see whether it was empty, went to the wrong tomb. Okay? It would also mean that the Jewish leaders who asked Pilate for a guard to guard the tomb were stupid enough to seal the wrong tomb. Really? That didn't happen. Everybody knew which tomb it was. They did not go to the wrong tomb. The Jewish leaders knew which tomb it was because they took the Roman soldiers there to the tomb. They made sure that the body was inside. Then they sealed the tomb and they kept guard over that tomb. So even the Jewish leaders at the time never said, oh, they went to the wrong tomb, right? It was the right tomb. So let's take a break at this point. And when we return, we're going to talk about the next 4 or 5 or 6 arguments that people make against the resurrection, and we'll discuss them as the intern, okay? So join me after the break.
The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ are central events in our salvation. Yet few Christians have a good grasp of the first-century historical and religious context in which the crucifixion took place, nor of its true significance for the people of that time, and hence for our time as well. In her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, biblical scholar Dr. Jeannie Constantinou puts modern readers in the center of the events of Christ's Passion, bringing the best of modern scholarship to bear while keeping her interpretation faithful in every particular to the early church tradition. If you love Search the Scriptures live on Ancient Faith Radio, you'll also love The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, available now at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so everybody agrees that Jesus died and was buried in that particular tomb. All the other arguments against those facts are just utterly ridiculous. And the tomb was found empty on Sunday. So, we've proven that those are really very, very weak arguments. And so we're no longer going to consider those explanations. And instead, let's consider how people try to explain the empty tomb. Okay, so we agree, everybody agrees it was the right tomb and it was empty. So now let's talk about how people explain away the empty tomb. Well, the primary explanation for the Christian view of the resurrection is actually recorded in our subject for the study, Matthew's Gospel, that the disciples stole the body while the guards were sleeping. So, and Matthew tells us this directly in chapter 28, that the soldiers having, the tomb is empty, they witness, they don't see Jesus leaving the tomb. They experience the angel that announces the resurrection to the women. They're terrified. They go back to the Jewish leaders, not to Pilate, of whom they are terrified, but to the Jewish leaders, and they tell them what happened. And the Jews bribe them with a lot of money to say that the disciples came and stole him while we were sleeping. So let's analyze that claim. And by the way, St. Matthew says, and this story is still being told today. And that is still one of the explanations, probably the most common explanation that is given by the Jewish people today. So it was a very effective lie. It's still believed. But let's analyze it. Could the body have been stolen while the grave was being guarded by a contingent of Roman soldiers who were bribed to say that the disciples stole him? So is that a strong claim that the disciples stole the body while the soldiers were asleep? Well, first of all, how would the soldiers know that the body was stolen if they were sleeping at the time? Nobody knows what's going on while they're sleeping. So I suppose you could say, well, they surmised that it happened while they were sleeping. But what is the chance that all of the soldiers were sleeping at the same time? It was a minimum of 4 soldiers. Could have been as many as 15 soldiers. What is the chance that all of them fell asleep? The chance is actually 0. Okay, and why is that? Because of the punishment for falling asleep on guard duty. Do you know what the punishment was? I mean, you probably, I don't think we ever talked about this. I can't remember if we ever did. Crucifixion as a punishment was primarily started for 2 groups of people, slaves and soldiers. Why? Because the Romans demanded absolute obedience from their slaves, because they couldn't take a chance on them rebelling, and from their soldiers. So if you disobeyed orders, went AWOL, that means absent without leave, just left, or you fell asleep on guard duty, the punishment was crucifixion. Would that keep you awake? I think so. I think the chances that somebody would fall asleep on guard duty would be almost 0. Certainly not all 4 of them, because they knew what the consequence would be if they fell asleep during guard duty. This is why the Roman army was the most disciplined army in the world, because the consequences for disobeying orders or doing things like falling asleep on guard duty was so severe. So don't imagine that they would be like you, where you're trying to stay up but you fall asleep. These are professional soldiers who had a lot to lose if they were to fall asleep. So there's no way that happened. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that they did fall asleep while on guard duty. Would it have been possible for the disciples to sneak over them or beyond them or past them? It's not like they were guarding the tomb and they were far away from the tomb. They were right there in front of the tomb. Okay? It's not like they were, a block away from the tomb. They were right outside the tomb. Could the disciples have moved that giant stone weighing supposedly 2 tons or more without the guards waking up? It's absolutely not. They couldn't have moved it quietly. You needed several men to move the stone. But again, for the sake of argument, let's say that the guards were sleeping and the disciples somehow managed to move that giant stone right from under the nose of these young soldiers, okay? Then let's ask ourselves, why did they bother to unwrap the body? Because when the people entered the tomb, again, by the way, the tomb was closed, was shut. So when the tomb was discovered and the body of Jesus was not there, the grave cloths were there. Why would the disciples of Jesus stop and unwrap the body. Okay, nobody in his right mind would have stopped to unwrap the body and steal it while there were guards outside who, and if they were caught, if the disciples were caught stealing the body, that would be considered grave robbery. That was a capital offense under Roman law. They would have been crucified themselves. So anybody who is crazy enough to try to steal the body, and think that they could actually move a giant stone out of the entrance of the tomb, go inside and steal the body, would have stolen the body very quickly. They wouldn't have stopped to unwrap it, even if they could, because it was very unlikely that anybody could have unwrapped the body, because we talked about that, how they placed these resins, the myrrh and aloes were either dry powders or resins that were placed on the body, and it was wrapped with these various strips of cloth, and it hardened around the body. You couldn't have removed it. It stuck to the body. But there it was. The orthonia, the strips of cloth in the shape of the human body, were there. Okay? They were present there in the grave. So how do you explain that? Makes absolutely no sense. So can you see how ridiculous this argument is that the disciples stole the body? And as we go through all the objections to the resurrection, point by point by point, can you see that it makes more sense to believe in the resurrection of Christ than to disbelieve in the resurrection? Because none of the arguments actually make any sense. So the body was not stolen. It's simply impossible. It could not have happened. Nobody in their right mind would take that chance, and certainly would stop to remove the cloths, even if they were able to sneak past the guards and move the stone. The sixth argument or claim made against the resurrection is that Jesus appeared to the disciples in their dreams. Isn't that lovely? The followers of Jesus were so upset about his death, they dreamed about him, and that's how they got this idea of the resurrection. This, of course, is absolutely ridiculous. No one ever mentioned Jesus appearing to them in a dream. That is not the resurrection. That is not consistent with the historical record that we have. It has no basis at all. And in addition to that, people said they actually saw him. Nobody once ever says, I had a dream about Jesus. There's plenty of dreams in the Bible, by the way, so there's nothing wrong with that. But nobody said that. Instead, people said that they saw him. They touched him. They experienced him alive again in the body. Well, did everybody have a dream about him? Because a lot of people claimed it. Of course not. This is one of the stupidest arguments. Okay, number 7. The seventh claim against the resurrection. Jesus appeared to them as a ghost. They were hallucinating. The same thing with the dream kind of argument. So, first of all, there's no such a thing as a mass hallucination, okay? A lot of people, again, hundreds of people said that they saw Jesus, okay? A mass hallucination doesn't happen, and he couldn't have been a ghost because all of these people who claim to have seen the risen Christ touched him, hugged him, touched his flesh, put their fingers in his wounds, ate with him, talked to him, etc. This is not a hallucination or, a ghost. The eighth is actually very similar to the previous ones. The eighth claim against the resurrection basically is that the disciples lied. So the body was stolen. They lied about that. They said that he appeared to them. They lied about that. Basically, people are saying the disciples lied. And they decided to continue the movement without Jesus. Now, Father Costa was telling me that, again, I started this program by telling you about how these ideas were very popular. People were looking for ways to explain the resurrection in some kind of logical fashion. And this was very popular, throughout the 20th century. And in the 1970s, when Father Costa was a young theology seminarian student, not in North, he had previously finished a couple of Orthodox institutions, but now he was in Quebec City, and he was interacting with, other seminarians at a Catholic seminary. And at that time, they were talking about the resurgence, because this is Quebec City, where they speak French. And the idea was, they said there was no resurrection, there was a resurgence. There was a kind of revival of the idea about Jesus, a return to the ministry of Jesus, an embracing of the memory of Jesus, not a bodily resurrection. So the disciples decided to just carry on for Jesus in his memory. Okay, I was hearing the same thing when I was in college and in graduate school, okay? They just decided to say that Jesus rose because he rose in their hearts. Aw, isn't that sweet? Again, this seems on its face a perfectly rational explanation of what happened. The disciples were sad and disappointed and depressed. They were convinced that he was the Messiah, so they decided to carry on for Jesus and continue his ministry, even though he was dead. Of course, this has absolutely no historical evidence to support it. And in fact, what actually happened was that after Jesus was crucified, they believed the movement was over. It's the opposite of what people are saying. Oh, there was this resurgence. They decided to carry on for Jesus. It's the opposite. They said, it's over, guys. And where do we see that? Again, in the historical documents that we do have about the resurrection, the Gospels, in the Gospel of Luke, there's a beautiful story about Jesus meeting on the day of resurrection, meeting a couple of disciples who are depressed, okay? Cleopas and another disciple. And they're talking about what happened to Jesus. And he said, what are you talking about? They said, are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened? And he said, what things? And they said, well, about Jesus of Nazareth, we thought he was the Messiah, but now he's dead. So by Sunday, the disciples had given up on the idea of Jesus being the Messiah because he had died. They weren't sitting there together planning about how they were going to continue the ministry without Jesus. It's quite the opposite. So although this seems kind of logical, it's actually very illogical and very unhistorical. They didn't even have time to think about what they were going to do and how they were going to continue without Jesus and why continue without Jesus. Okay, first of all, they were afraid. They were in hiding behind locked doors. They were worried about surviving because they believed that they would be arrested and crucified next. It was just a matter of time. They were grieving Jesus. They were not deciding how they were going to put their lives together. They were not figuring out how they were going to carry on. They were figuring out, how can we get out of Jerusalem alive, go back to Galilee and resume our lives? That's what the disciples were thinking about. And things changed very suddenly on Sunday morning with absolutely no reason for it other than the resurrection. What changed? All of a sudden they become bold. Okay, the change happened with lightning speed on Sunday morning, almost immediately, fewer than 3 days after the crucifixion. While they were still mourning, while they were still fearful, long before they ever had a chance to sort of process what happened to Jesus and come up with a plan of how they were going to continue on because Jesus rose in their hearts. You see how ridiculous that argument is? Instead, it does not make any sense that the disciples lied about the resurrection. And by the way, if they were going to continue on and keep the movement going for Jesus' sake and the memory of Jesus or any other kind of resurgence that you want to talk about, that makes no sense. Because what did they go out to preach? If the early church is not based on, the foundation of the early church is not the resurrection, what is it based on? If we look at the documents of early Christianity and Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul, what is the message of the apostles? What were they going to go out and preach? That, oh, guys, I've come to bring you the good news. What's the good news? God loves you. Now get out of here. I've come to bring you the good news. Remember that they went to the synagogues and they preached. And what did they preach? When they said, I've come with good news. What's the good news? Love your neighbor as yourself. Is that the gospel? Absolutely not. When they would go to a synagogue, they said, I have good news. What's the good news? The Messiah has come. It's Jesus of Nazareth. He wasn't just the Messiah. He was the Lord himself. He fulfilled the prophecies. He was crucified, but he rose from the dead. And because of that, you too can have eternal life. That's the gospel. Nobody would care if Jesus died but didn't rise. Nobody would care. That would mean nothing. Why would they go out to preach that? You see, the idea of they went out to preach the love of neighbor and do good to other people, that's not unique to Christianity. Even the pagans had that as philosophy. They believed in virtues and things like that. So there is nothing to say without the resurrection. So there's something else we have to consider. We have to consider the motivation of the disciples. Did the disciples lie? Let's see whether or not they had any motivation to lie. Did they have any motivation? Absolutely none. There is no motivation for them to lie. When people say that the disciples stole the body, or for whatever reason they said he appeared in their dreams, and they said he rose from the dead, we should consider their motivation. Okay? Now, remember that everybody knew that Jesus predicted that he would rise from the dead. I don't know how the disciples were so shocked by it, but they were. Remember that the Jewish leaders asked for the guards to be posted for 3 days because they knew that Jesus had predicted that he would rise. And they were going to remove the guards at the end of 3 days. So we didn't even talk about that. If the disciples were going to steal the body, why didn't they do it on the 4th day? Why would they try to steal it while the guards were guarding it? They could have stolen it on the 4th day and said he rose on the 3rd day after the guards left. You see how ridiculous that is? Okay, so Jesus predicted that he would rise again. If he didn't rise again, then what is he? He's a false prophet. That's what the Jews say. He's a false Messiah. He's a fraud. And so why would the disciples be promoting him? Why would the disciples sacrifice everything in their lives and continue this movement for a lie? They would be angry. They would realize that they had wasted 3 years of their lives following somebody who lied to them. So last week we talked about this group in New York, headquartered in New York, followers of a rabbi called Menachem Schneerson, who was the leader of the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic Jewish community in Brooklyn, and his congregation was convinced that he was the Messiah before he died. Then he died. And they're still saying that he is the Messiah. Most of them think he will rise again in the future. Some believe he's already risen invisibly, okay? And so people are saying, oh, this is just like early Christianity. They couldn't let go of the Messiah. They were so invested in this idea that he was the Messiah. They simply kept it going. They kept it going. Really? No one claims to have seen Rabbi Schneerson alive again, have they? No one claims that at all because he hasn't risen from the dead. It's been 31 years. He died in 1994. Still hasn't risen from the dead, and they're still waiting for him to rise from the dead. This is not the same situation as the resurrection. Jesus rose in less than 3 24-hour days. He rose Sunday morning. He died on Friday. He didn't wait for 31 years to rise. Okay, can you see the difference? Rabbi Schneerson was a false prophet. I can understand why that group could not let go of the idea that he was the rabbi and the Messiah. Their rabbi was the Messiah because they invested their whole lives following him. Generations are still following him. They listened to him. They followed him. There was a cult of personality around this rabbi. Okay, and their whole lives, people didn't send their children to regular school. They sent them to these Jewish schools. They spent decades following this person. That's not the case with the apostles. They spent 3 years following Jesus. So if he turned out to be a fraud, what would they do? Make up a lie and go around the world trying to promote this lie? For what purpose? For what reason? Okay? So after Jesus rose, there were dozens of witnesses to his bodily resurrection, even on that very first day. Dozens of witnesses. The women mirror bearers, the disciples who were hiding in the upper room, other people we don't know about, including people we would only know about from the Gospel of Luke, those two disciples walking on the road to Emmaus. There were dozens of people who didn't say, oh, we decided to carry on for Jesus. We saw him in a dream. He appeared as a ghost. No, they saw him. They touched him. They saw his body, touched his body, hugged him, ate with him. All of those things. This is a physical resurrection. There's a huge difference between the followers of Rabbi Schneerson, the Chabad Lubavitch people, which I, have a lot of sympathy for because I can understand why they're so invested in believing in him. They believed him. They trusted him. They devoted their entire lives and their families' lives to following him. And if he's not the Messiah, all of that was for nothing. That he lied to them. After 31 years, they're still waiting. Okay? So they can't face the reality of the fact that he's not the Messiah. This didn't happen in the case of Jesus. They had 4,000 Chabad houses around the world. Not in the case of Jesus. What would the disciples have done if Jesus never rose? They would just go back to Galilee. Very simple. They spent 3 years following a rabbi and now it's over. Can you see how different that is? People try to make these analogies and say, oh, this is the same as the resurrection. No, it isn't, because Jesus actually appeared to people and everything changed because of it. Didn't remain the same, and they just kept watching videos of Jesus and things like this. So I want you to understand that the disciples did not insist upon the resurrection of Christ out of desperation because they had devoted their entire lifetimes to him, because they had buildings and organizations and schools like Chabad does, okay? If Jesus had not risen, they would just go back to their lives. They would say, okay, this didn't work out. He's not the Messiah after all, okay? There's a huge difference between the belief of the Jews who belong to that sect that their Messiah, that their rabbi is the Messiah. That's a matter of belief, of faith, of opinion. But the followers of Jesus did not believe he rose from the dead. They experienced him alive again. There's a huge difference there. Nobody in Chabad says if they've experienced their Messiah alive again, right? Prove it. But we have a huge following, a movement that begins with a spark lighting a lot of dry brush, and immediately it explodes. It was the same thing on the day of resurrection. Everything changed because they saw Jesus alive again in the flesh. There is no motivation for the disciples to lie, okay? Now, we should talk about motivation because this is something that we often think about. For example, in the law, if somebody is accused of murder, one of the first things that they consider is whether or not they had a motivation to commit the murder. Did they have a motivation to lie? Does somebody have a motivation to lie? Okay, we always look at the motivation because that's normal. We think, well, they had a reason to do what they did, right? Somebody lies for a reason. Somebody invents a story for their own purposes, for their own self-interest. They want to stay out of trouble. They want to make money. They want to impress people. They want to have followers. They want more business, so people lie, all right? What is the motivation for the disciples? Because I'm telling you, this is, if the resurrection is a lie, it's a lie against their interests. It's not a lie that helped them in any way, okay? One of the most common things that people say is that the disciples invented the doctrine of the resurrection to sell their new religion, to convince people to follow this new religion. Okay, and they say that about the divinity of Christ too. The disciples did not believe that Jesus was God. Nobody did. They just made that up later to convince people to join this new religion they were starting. And people who hear that, who are fairly intelligent people, but don't know any better, they say, that sounds plausible. I guess they invented it to promote this new religion, Christianity. Okay, again, here we see that something can seem reasonable if you don't really consider it very deeply. If you just look at the surface of the argument, this actually makes no sense at all because there was no new religion. That didn't exist. There was no such thing as Christianity. That they were a sect within Judaism, and they didn't have a new religion. And by the way, they didn't want a new religion. The followers of Jesus were Jews. They were devout Jews. They loved their religion. Okay? This is only plausible. Anybody who could cling to this idea, I can't imagine how you would, because this makes no sense. It's one of the stupidest explanations that people give for the resurrection. There was no new religion. There was no such thing as Christianity, or even the word Christian. The only difference between the followers of Jesus and other Jews is that the followers of Jesus believed he was the Messiah. In every other way, they were exactly the same. And they didn't want to leave Judaism and start some new religion. For what purpose? As a matter of fact, just because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, that didn't qualify them as that didn't disqualify them from being Jews. They didn't leave Judaism because they believed Jesus was the Messiah and he died, just like the followers of Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, 31 years later after he died, they're still Jewish. They still think he's the Messiah. So in other words, the disciples didn't invent the resurrection to try to get people to follow some new religion that they were starting, because they weren't starting a new religion. There wasn't a separate religion. As a matter of fact, they never wanted to leave Judaism. They were kicked out. Did you know that? The followers of Jesus were kicked out of Judaism, but that didn't happen for 50 years. It was 50 years before the Jews said to the followers of Jesus, enough with you. You're not Jewish. We don't recognize you as Jewish. But by then, the church was well on its way. You see what I'm trying to say? So we're still looking for some plausible motivation to invent stories about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and we haven't found them. Okay? But we're going to take a break at this point, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
All right, so we're discussing the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the arguments that are made by people against it. And the most common one basically is that the disciples lied. They stole the body, or they said he rose when really he didn't. They decided to just carry on for Jesus, so they invented this story. So we have to really, in order for that to be a convincing argument against the resurrection, you have to give me a motivation. What is a motivation? There's actually no motivation. People say, they want to start their new religion. No, they're not starting a new religion. They're Jews, and they remain Jews for a long time, and eventually the Jews themselves kick the Christians out, okay? But there is no such thing as Christianity. They have no motivation to do any of this if it's a lie. Okay, what are they're going to do? And by the way, the people who insisted that Jesus rose, again, I said this, it's not 2 people or 12 people, but hundreds of eyewitnesses. What motivation do they have? It can't be money. You can't bribe them. What's in it for them? They didn't, in other words, the disciples were poor. They didn't have the money to go around buying off people and saying, listen, we're going to give you $20 to say that Jesus rose from the dead. We'll give you a gold coin. They didn't have the ability to bribe people. These were people who said that Jesus rose, experienced him alive again in the body. And by the way, how is it possible that none of those people ever recanted it? Nobody denied it. If you sort of convince a bunch of people to lie, by the way, this is something that we have seen in other religious movements. There are people who said, for example, the Book of Mormon, the scriptures of the Mormon church, there's in the beginning, supposedly the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, said that he discovered these gold plates with this strange writing on it. He was able to decipher it, and this is the Book of Mormon. So in the front of the book, it says that there were people who witnessed, he showed these gold plates to, and they has their names of the people who witnessed them and said, oh yeah, these gold plates really existed because later they disappeared. Well, all of those people recanted, if they ever signed it to begin with, agreed that I don't know how he convinced them to say, yes, I saw those hieroglyphic kind of gold plates with this strange writing on it that he translated and made into the Book of Mormon. They all recanted. How is it that the hundreds of eyewitnesses of the resurrection, not one ever recanted it? If they had recanted, don't you think that the Jews, the Jewish leaders that were trying to stop this movement, would have talked about him? Wouldn't we find that statement in the Jewish history, in the Jewish Talmud and other Jewish writings, that followers of Jesus later admitted that it was a lie? We don't see that anywhere. That would be the easiest way to disprove the resurrection. Okay, but we don't see that because it didn't happen. None of those hundreds of people ever recanted their story. And instead, they insisted on the truth of the resurrection at great personal cost. So there is no motivation to lie. As a matter of fact, all of their statements were statements of the highest level of believability. As a matter of fact, some of you, you've heard the idea of hearsay evidence in court. In court, we don't accept hearsay evidence. In other words, if somebody goes to witness to give a testimony, they can't say, I heard so-and-so say. They're not allowed to give that kind of evidence. You have to bring the actual person who made the statement. You can't just say what you heard. That's hearsay, hearsay. Hearsay evidence is not admissible in court, except for certain exceptions. And one of them is a statement against interest. If a person makes a statement against what is in their own interests, that is an exception. That statement is allowed into evidence because people don't make statements against their own interest. And all of the statements of the disciples about Jesus Christ were statements against interest if you consider what they had to lose by teaching and insisting upon the resurrection. What happened to the apostles after Jesus rose and after Pentecost? What happened to them? Did they have a great life of luxury and fame? And were they rewarded for we're not talking about spiritual rewards here. I'm talking about in the eyes of the world. What did they have to gain by promoting this lie? They left their livelihoods, their homes, their homeland, their friends. They gave up every physical comfort to become a wandering preacher, to go from place to place. For what? If it was a lie. Not to mention the fact that how many people would do this for a lie? Maybe you could find a couple of mentally unbalanced people who would insist upon a lie. Maybe there were something wrong with them, but you're not going to get hundreds of people to insist upon the same lie when there's nothing in it for them, when they have nothing to gain. They went from place to place, preaching about Jesus Christ. Do you think they were welcomed with banquets and flowers and red carpet treatment and perfumes and roses cast? Of course not. They were tortured. They were beaten. They were imprisoned. They experienced every kind of hardship. And would you go through that for a lie? No one in his right mind would do this. No one could convince hundreds of people to accept this lifestyle if it was a fabrication, because it was a hard life. Today we look at them and the icons and the stained glass windows on the doors of churches and the Gospels, and we say, wow, the apostles, they were really something. They didn't get great treatment while they were alive. They suffered a lot. Next week, I think we're going to talk about that, just kind of very briefly. I think it's important for us to remember this, because the followers of Jesus, because today we revere them, today we respect them, today we, adore the apostles. We're getting ready this week. It's going to be the feast day of the holy apostles and of Peter and Paul. We adore them, but their lives were nothing but difficulty. But they did it because they loved Christ, because what they experienced was real, it was true, and nothing could stop them from sharing that with the world. But they went through all these things, okay, because it was true. Now, I have to tell you that when I was teaching college students, some of them said, well, yeah, they lied about it. They went around this world and they did these things, but they did it because, they had nothing really to live for. I have to tell you that. It's so unbelievable. And I just thought, okay, if you're 18 or 19, maybe you could be that stupid. The idea that they just went ahead and promoted this lie and suffered all of these hardships, including deaths by torture, because they had nothing to live for. People who do not have the privileges that we have in the Western world, the conveniences and the air conditioning, the cell phones and the cars, people lived for thousands of years without those things, and they loved their lives. They loved their families. They loved their homes. They never thought that life was not worth living because they didn't have electricity, okay? We don't love our lives because we have these things. We love our lives because of the things that are intangible, because of our family, our home, our nation. So the idea that they just went ahead and went along with it because they didn't mind dying a death by torture and suffering all these hardships because their life wasn't that great anyhow is utterly ridiculous. Okay, only a moron would think that. I'm sorry to say I had some of them in my classrooms. Okay, but just think about it. It's okay if you're 18, you could be a little bit stupid, but you gotta just think about it a little bit more deeply. There was no motivation for the disciples to lie about their experience of Jesus. Instead, it was against their interests. They had nothing to gain. They weren't going to get money, property, position, honors. Instead, they were dishonored and they suffered a lot. That is the historical record. Now, some people will say, and I had my students say this too, they died for their religion. No, they didn't die for their religion. They didn't die for their philosophy. They didn't die for their beliefs. They died for Jesus Christ, and they died because they wanted the world to know that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And they never, under any circumstances, denied that or recanted that in the slightest. Now, just because somebody dies for something doesn't make it true. We all agree with that. The men who flew planes into the Twin Towers in New York City on 9/11 and other places, they were promised 72 virgins. They were going to go to heaven and have 72 virgins with which they could have relations. That was their motivation. They died for that. Of course, it wasn't true. So just because someone dies for something doesn't make it true. But they did not die. They died for a belief. The apostles died for a fact. They died insisting that what they experienced was true. Not what they believed was true, but what they knew to be true because they had experienced it firsthand. Jesus Christ risen from the dead in the flesh. We believe in the resurrection based on their testimony, but they were the eyewitnesses, and that's what made the apostles so important in the life of the early church. That's why there are no apostles today. Not the way we mean it back then. They were the eyewitnesses to the resurrection. They were the eyewitnesses to a historical event. So, the idea that all these people just concocted a lie and they sacrificed everything that they knew and loved and every personal comfort to simply go around promoting a lie is absolutely absurd. It's too absurd for any intelligent person to believe. So, the church exists today because of the resurrection. The existence of the church is the greatest proof of the resurrection. I know people aren't very persuaded by that, but that's the truth. If it weren't, this is why the Chabad Lubavitch community, they're still alive. They're still around 31 years after the death of their rabbi, whom they believe to be the Messiah. I don't think they're going to survive more than 100 years. They might linger, because last week we talked about the false messiahs, and their movements continued for a while, but not for long. So that movement is going to die out. Eventually, people will just not be able to accept that he's coming back from the dead. Okay? This did not happen in the case of the apostles. The opposite happened. There was a sudden infusion of energy and determination and life and enthusiasm, something that the world has never known before. And it happened suddenly, all on one day, on Easter Sunday, on Pascha, because people began to see Christ alive again in the flesh. And I just want you to think about what that meant. You know, we all have people that we love whom we lost. I was talking to a widow just the other day, and her husband died a few months ago. And I asked her how she was doing, and she says, you know, she's still in that phase of grief when it's difficult to accept. She says, I know he's not coming back, but I still somehow feel like he is. So, but she is trying to move on with her life. She knows in her heart the truth of what happened, okay? But it's hard to wrap your mind around that. The disciples didn't go through that. They mourned for Jesus from Friday until Sunday morning, and then it was over. And what happened was not an extended grieving process during which they finally went through the stages of grief and came to acceptance that Jesus was dead and decided to carry on without him. No, everything changed when he stepped into the upper room and appeared alive before them, when he appeared to the myrrh-bearing women alive, when he appeared to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus alive. That's what changed everything. Nothing else could explain this sudden turnaround in which these men who were formerly fearful now were like lions, enthusiastic. They were imbued with this phenomenal love and devotion and passion for Christ that led them around the world, that they were willing to sacrifice everything for him. And because of the resurrection, because this is the greatest moment in the history of the world, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the most important thing that ever happened, because it gives us eternal life. Without the resurrection, we would not have eternal life. So there's something else for you to think about, and we'll continue this next week, just for one more lesson perhaps. But here's what I want you to think about, because, you know, we talk a lot about the cross. Obviously, the cross is important. But without the resurrection, we would not be saved. So salvation is not in the cross. It's through the cross. But salvation and eternal life comes from Jesus Christ rising from the dead, trampling down death by death. So we're going to devote one more lesson to the resurrection. And on this lesson, we're going to focus on somebody who was an ardent, passionate enemy of Jesus Christ, who came to believe in the resurrection. And we're also going to talk about what we can learn about our own future. What will our lives be like in the kingdom of heaven? What kind of body will we have? What do we know about the resurrected body because of the resurrection appearances? So we'll talk about that next week, and I hope you will join us. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantino. You've been listening to Search the Scriptures Live, and this is a listener-supported program of Ancient Faith Radio. And now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. Amen. Good night.
Depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, O